Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Spencer Abrams. I'm the Manager of Operations, Events, and Communications with the Census Project. Welcome to the apportionment data from the 2020 Census, a Census Project briefing for Foundations. Before we begin, I just want to run through a few logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and all participants are in listen-only mode. There will be time at the end of the webinar for a question and answer session. If you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to type them into the questions box, which you will see in the GoToWebinar interface. Again, you can submit questions at any point during the webinar, but we will hold them till the end of the webinar, at which point they will be read out to our panelists. Now I'd like to welcome our moderator and host, Mr. Steve Jost. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you, Spencer. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Jost. I'm a consultant to the Census Project, which is the largest, most diverse, and longest standing coalition of folks who care deeply about good data and getting the country properly counted and described every 10 years and every year in between. And I'm happy to be of service to the co-directors of the Census Project, Mary Jo Hoeksema and Howard Feinberg. And today we're going to give you a presentation on what's been a prominent topic in the news for the last month or two. The first release of the 2020 count, the apportionment count, how we apportion the seats in our Congress. I'll tell you that my background is I was the associate director at the Census Bureau in both 2000 and 2010 when we released the apportionment numbers. It is probably the #1 press event of the decade for the Census Bureau. Typically, the Bureau, just to give you a sort of a scale, has 40 to 50 million visitors to its website each year, throughout the year. In 2010, when we released the new apportionment count for Congress, we had 26 million unique visitors in 8 hours that day to look at the maps that we created and the data. So clearly this is a big deal for the country. It's unlike any other country. We have a high standard of perfection about our count because so much is at stake. It's how we make sure that the country is fairly represented, and it has worked successfully for more than 2 centuries as the country has grown from 13 colonies and evolved across the continent and readjusted the representation in Congress every decade, with one exception in 1920, which I think Dan's going to talk a little bit about, when the leadership of the House of Representatives realized that the country had shifted from a majority representation in rural areas to a majority representation in the cities, and then refused to reapportion the Congress because rural areas did not want to lose power. And that led to a statute that we have been operating on since on how to reapportion. Our 2 experts on this topic today, the first is Dan Bout. Dan's a historian of the census and studies personal data. He's the associate professor of history at Colgate University and a faculty fellow at the Data and Society Research Institute in New York, and also has been an advisor at the Beck Center at Georgetown University, which you'll hear a little bit about today, which has been doing a lot of work on census issues, but also especially the apportionment process. After Dan, we're going to hear from John Thompson. He was the director of the Census Bureau from August 2013 in the Obama administration through June 2017 in the Trump administration. He was a career executive at Census for 27 years and led the decennial in 2000. Until he left in 2002 to go be the CEO of the National Opinion Research Center, also known as NORC, at the University of Chicago. And he is currently a member of the American Statistical Association's Task Force on Quality Indicators that is reviewing the 2020 data and providing a third-party conclusion on the quality of the census data and its fitness for use as it is progressively rolled out over the next couple of years. So as Spencer said, if you have any questions, you can type them in the questions box. We're going to have a Q&A period following our two speakers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan Baff.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to imagine all of your smiling faces out there since I can't see them. I recognize they might actually not be smiling faces because these are difficult times, but I really appreciate you all joining us for this time. You can see in the, I'm a historian, and so I'm going to be speaking to you today both to give us a sense of the history that has gotten us to the apportionment process as it now runs, but also using history to illustrate something of how the apportionment process operates today. Faded in the background of the slide, you can see the US Census was created by the US Constitution. So when all those folks are out there gathering data, when we're filling out our forms online or by mail, when we're talking to an enumerator, that's a mass mobilization. It gets a lot of attention. The reason that happens, the fundamental constitutional reason it happens, is to allow for what's happening right now in the census process, to get us to these apportionment figures, eventually to get us to redistricting data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is happening right now, how the census continues after the count, and then give us a little history of the automatic apportionment, how we got into the system that we have now, and very briefly by thinking about some of the elements of that system that could change, but probably won't. So we go to the next slide. I'm using here an illustration from a 1940 census, and this is how folks at the 1940 census attempted to explain the kind of procedures that are happening right now in the census. So at the very top, you see the enumeration there in blue. This is what we would today call getting out the count. In 1940, there was no mail census. There was certainly no internet self-response. So instead, you had an enumerator knocking on every door, going to every household, trying to find every single person, and then writing out by hand all of their information, their name and a host of other information alongside that. They would do this on paper, carrying a large leather portfolio full of these pieces of paper. They would all be brought back to the local district office, then all shipped in these big wooden crates back to Washington, D.C., massive amounts of wooden crate paper moving across the nation to Washington, D.C., where then, by hand, a large staff in Washington, D.C. would go through. You can see it there's the nice little drawing of the trucks driving through and the huge stacks of paper that are then being there in operation too, being pushed around on carts. And what they do after they push all those carts full of documents around together is take all of the documents for the people's counts, find all of the documents for the housing, which was also being counted at the same time, match them, make sure that they match together, reconcile any problems with the ways they do or don't match properly, those two pieces of paper, kind of staple them together. And then as they do that, once they've got them all stapled together, they just count by hand all of the people on each set, add all those things up, and figure out for each state how many people were in each state. Now, whenever you hear people talk about the census today, and they talk about something called the census unedited file, the CUF, they're basically talking about this kind of process. It's much more sophisticated, it's computerized, you can't quite see it, but there's a very similar set of processes that have developed since 1940 that work along the same set of lines. And it's from that CUF that are produced the state level totals, which are going to be used for apportionment, which we'll talk a little bit more about. After that, you follow down on your table there, those pieces of paper get shoved off and they're edited and coded. So they go through to make sure that everyone has all of the proper characteristics, their sex, age, race, relation, as are allowed in allowable categories. The Census Bureau only allows certain kinds of categories, certain kinds of entries. And then they get coded so they can be tabulated by an electronic machine, or these days by a computer. So that's then allows them to make more detailed tables that are going to be used to figure out how to do redistricting. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to just kind of summarize what I just said with this table. It gives you a sense of what the Census Bureau does, which is what I just talked about, right? You fill out the forms, you count them for each state, you create and can tabulate all these characteristics. Why does the Census Bureau do this, right? The Constitution requires the Census Bureau to do this. It requires an actual enumeration. Once you count those state populations, that allows for apportionment. And what apportionment means in this case is that it decides how many seats in the House of Representatives each state gets. That also means it determines how many electoral college votes each state gets, because that's determined also by the number of House of Representatives plus the number of senators. And then the final stage is used for what's called redistricting. It's also confusingly sometimes called reapportionment, I think just to mess with us. And that's then the redrawing of congressional districts within states. So why does this matter? The enumeration, it gives us a sense of who we are as a nation. It's like places on their welcome signs put their population to let you know who they are. The apportionment is important because this allocates political power between the states, and then redistricting is significant insofar as it allocates power within the states, drawing those lines within states based on how many seats they've been apportioned. Next slide, please. So there's lots of ways to tell the history of apportionment, but for our purposes today, I think it's useful. You can think of it as a kind of bifurcated story: before the automatic apportionment system, and then after the automatic apportionment system. Now, the graph I'm giving you tells you what I think is one of the important parts of the story. You see, before the automatic apportionment system, the orange shows you the population of the United States growing. It's growing swiftly, continues to grow swiftly. On top of that, on the other side, we see a graph in gray showing you the number of seats in the House of Representatives. What you'll notice is that it's not entirely all the same, but the number of seats in the House of Representatives tended to grow. In fact, it grew along with the growing of the US population. After the automatic apportionment system, you'll note the seats in the House of Representatives have remained exactly the same the entire time. Well, the US population has tripled during that period of time. This is the most important thing that the automatic apportionment system does, is it keeps in place this House at 435 seats, keeps in place the system that allows for a redistribution of power, even though it means that every year a number of states lose seats in the House of Representatives, which is not a happy thing for a state. I'm sure any of you who are in a state that expects it might lose a seat are feeling it right now. So go to the next slide, please. So before the automatic apportionment system, Congress, who has authority to run the apportionment, to decide how its membership works in the Constitution, would pass a new law after every census. They would get information from the Census Bureau about the number of people in each state. They would, as a representative body, decide how big should the House be. They would debate this. Not coincidentally, they would often end up getting a size of the House, choosing a size of the House, in which no states were going to lose any representation, which is part of then why it tended to increase the size of the House from year to year. And so they would pass a bill like this one. This is from 1901, which this one says it's going to be 386 members in the House of Representatives. And then they would go through and they would just list how many seats went to each house. And that was the end of the story. Congress had made this decision. As Steve noted, this did not happen in 1920. And Steve gave the conventional story we've been telling. Some research we've been doing recently suggests that it wasn't primarily a demographic shift that led to the failure in 1920. The primary reason that the 1920 census failed is the House leadership decided that they weren't going to allow the House to get any larger. So had the House been allowed to grow to 483 seats, it was likely that an apportionment bill would have been passed. But the House leadership said it was never going to happen again, or that it wasn't going to happen then. It didn't. 1920, 1921, the apportionment failed again a number of times during the 20s. And that's why we got an automatic apportionment system, originally pitched as a kind of insurance policy to prevent any failure of apportionment ever in the future, but it has become, over the course of the next few decades after that, basically a mechanical system that just churns right through and reproduces the apportionment basically on its own. Go to the next slide, please. So with the automatic apportionment system, the House size is basically fixed at 435 seats. The Census Bureau was originally given 8 months in 1929 to get its state totals out. That was extended to 9 months in 1976. This year, it has taken longer, and it will take longer. It'll be more like 13 months by the time, because of the truly unprecedented circumstances of this pandemic. Originally, Congress had a 3-month explicit window to pass an alternative to that automatic system. Like I said, it started out as a kind of insurance policy against inaction that was shortened to 60 days in 1940. And then after 1941, any explicit window was removed, again, making it the automaticity of this essentially stronger, making it more automatic. Originally, the method of handling fractions was controversial. So one of the tricky things about this is when you take the state populations and you take the number of seats of House and you divide them up, you end up saying that Kansas should have a third of a representative. And representatives are not particularly amenable to being cut in thirds. And so as a result, you end up with this constant problem figuring out, like, how do we do with the fact that all these states are due a fraction of a representative? And there are a number of different, very plausible, all mathematically feasible solutions. These are all called different methods. So the method that eventually went out and has not changed since 1941 is called equal proportions. And I think Director Thompson will talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Another thing that has happened with this automatic apportionment system, something we call the announce and transmit tradition. Again, Steve mentioned this a little bit earlier, speaking about his own experience, which is astounding to think about that many people coming out for this announcement to see how many people are in the United States and trying to figure out what's going to happen to their state. The announce and transmit transition can be, its most significant factors are the Census Bureau calculates, it counts, whether it's counting by hand or counting by computer, it counts, creates those state populations. It then has, throughout this entire period, also run the method, the formula, the algorithm, whatever you want to call it, that then determines from those state populations how many representatives each state should get. And then it announces with the Secretary of Commerce publicly those findings, and it transmits them to the president. The president grabs that data transmission, does nothing to it, passes it right along to the House of Representatives, to the Congress. And then the Congress has 15 days to send off notifications to all of the state offices of state governors and telling them, your state in the next Congress in a couple of years is going to have so and so many representatives for the next 10 years after that, for the next 5 Congresses after that. So that's what we call the announce and transmit transition, public announcement and transmission by the president without touching it, allowing the expert work of the Census Bureau to carry through that data package. Next slide, please. So another thing that's happened in this automatic apportionment era is there's a lot of lawsuits, and we can expect there will be lawsuits coming forward. As Congress no longer became the key factor in every year choosing how the apportionment would work, instead the court has become a key site where those kinds of battles take place. Equal proportions and all these methods, modern methods, produce what's called a priority list, in which they list all of the states in order of which one gets the next seat. So they always have a list that says the 435th seat goes to such and such state. But then everyone knows who's the 436th seat. What state's supposed to get that one? And that state, sometimes the 437th state, right? All those ones around there, they can all do the math too. They hire smart folks. And so then they tend to go to court because there's lots of reasons they can claim that maybe they should be the people who actually should be getting that 435th seat. And so I've listed here a few, I won't go through them. Each of these suits, a couple from 1990, one from 2000, also end up, they went to Supreme Court. They also end up being important cases evaluating certain kinds of methods of things that are happening right now in Census Bureau to see whether or not those are deemed permissible. So in theory, the Supreme Court could decide that a seat should change hands. This hasn't happened yet, so it's still theoretical. The court has asserted that it could do that. It hasn't happened yet, but we should, and I'm just saying this so you can expect that there will be likely continued lawsuits, or there's likely to be some kind of controversy involving the 435th and 436th seats, because that's the way it normally works. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close by talking about what could, but probably won't change in all of this system. So this is just a sense where we've been living with this automatic apportionment system. the automatic apportionment system has proven very resilient, very robust, much more so than maybe one would have expected. We've survived so far in 2020, which is remarkable given the circumstances we're dealing with. But what could change? One thing that could change, or that could be subject to change, is something called the apportionment base, the people who count. So the most substantial change to the apportionment base in the history of the United States was the passage of the 14th Amendment, which changed the apportionment base to say that all formerly enslaved people would count fully in the census, whereas the very duly infamous 3/5 clause of the Constitution earlier had meant that enslaved people only counted for as 3/5 of people for the population base before that. So the 14th Amendment radically opened and ensured that all persons would be counted, all resident persons would be counted. And similarly, the apportionment base has not and has never depended on citizenship status. But as anyone who's been following the news knows, that has been a point of contention, for about 100 years on and off. But the heat has picked up in that contention. I and many others believe that a constitutional amendment would be required in order to make that any kind of change along those lines. So what could change? The size of the House of Representatives could change. It hasn't for 100 years, so it's unlikely, but it's possible. It could be changed by a simple bill passed by Congress and signed by the president. There's nothing else that sets that. The automatic system itself could be changed. Again, unlikely. It's stuck around, even been resilient during this census, so that could be changed by Congress. And the method of equal proportions could, again, by an act of Congress signed by the president, be changed for a different method. It's been challenged in courts before and upheld in 1990, but Congress could always decide to change that. In the end, all of these factors, basically static, they depend on what the data says, on how many folks are in each state as determined by the Census Bureau, which is why what's happening right now in the Census Bureau is so important. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll pass it along to John Thompson.
Next slide. Thank you very much, Dan. Very, very, very interesting. So first, I'll talk a little bit more about the method of equal proportions that is used to allocate the seats. Now, there's a real good description of it for those that are into mathematical algorithms on the Census Bureau website, and I put a link in here, and I'm sure these slides will be available after the webinar so that everybody, if you want to look it up, you can go there. But essentially, it's a mathematical algorithm for apportioning the 435 seats of the House. And it starts off with giving each state one representative. And then the remaining 385 seats are distributed based on size. And the algorithm works state by state, determining which state is most likely to get the next seat until all 385 are distributed. Importantly, sometimes the margin for missing the last seat can be very, very small. So as Dan mentioned, Utah sued after the 2000 census because they missed out on the last seat by 857 people. And that's not a very big number, but it also shows you why it is so important to count everyone in the state in the United States as accurately as possible, because very small differences can change who gets the last seat. So that's very important. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit more about how the apportionment counts are produced. And first off, historically, and this goes back to at least 1980 and probably more than that, but I know it goes back to 1980 because I was there then, and I've talked to Vince Barava, who is the director. But the Census Bureau has delivered the state population counts and the apportion results through a pre-announced, open public forum, so that everyone can see that these are the counts. Another thing, though, that's very important within the Census Bureau, and I know this went on in 2000, and I'm sure it went on in 2010, was that the results are kept to a very small group, that actually knows what the apportionment would be. They do calculate the apportionment. They run the method of equal proportions, but it's very tightly held. And for example, in 2000, I was the career person in charge of the 2020 census, and I did not know the results until Ken Pruitt, the director of the Census Bureau, announced them at a press conference. And I didn't want to know the results because I didn't want to say any decisions that I was making were going to be influenced by who would get the last seat. I really wanted to just, draw a very, very clean line between that. And by the way, Ken Pruitt also did not know the results. He didn't want to know the results either. So next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about census data quality. As Steve mentioned, I was on the American Statistical Association Quality Indicators Task Force, and I'm going to talk about that. But the 2020 census faced a number of challenges. First, as everyone knows, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that forced the Census Bureau to delay key operations. And in doing so, they also had requested through the Department of Commerce a 120-day extension of the legal deadlines. Another big thing they dealt with, and I can say this because I'm not at the Census Bureau, was political interference into the census process. And that started right after Wilbur Ross took the reins as Secretary of Commerce, when he arbitrarily decided to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Now, fortunately, that went to court, and the Supreme Court ultimately decided that he could not add that question. That was a good thing. But there were other things that went on. So, for example, the president issued a memo saying that the census was to give him counts that would exclude undocumented persons from the apportionment. That also generated some lawsuits, which have not yet been resolved, but I think that they're moot at this point since we have a new administration. Another big issue was that right before the census was going to start, the biggest operation, which is to collect the information from those households that don't self-respond, the Department of Commerce ordered them to truncate their schedule so that they could meet a statutory deadline of delivering apportionment by December 31st, even though the Census Bureau had asked for time to deliver them at the end of April. As I mentioned, there was lots of litigation over the census, and there might still be some litigation after the census. I'll talk more about that. And I also think that everyone is aware that the Census Bureau had to deal with a number of hurricanes that forced them to delay operations. They had wildfires all over the West, which again made them take precautionary actions. So all of these things have created some concern among many stakeholders, and some stakeholders have even expressed concerns about whether the census data will be fitness for use for apportionment, redistricting, and other purposes that Dan mentioned. So next slide. So where are we now about data quality? Well, the Census Bureau has become much more transparent since January 20th, 2010, and that's a very good thing. The Census Bureau also announced well before January 20th that it had encountered anomalies in the post-data collection or post-collection data processing. Now, this was not unexpected. The Census Bureau didn't make up the time they needed to do the post-collection data processing on a whim. It was based on a lot of experience and planning that said, we're going to encounter some anomalies and we're going to have to deal with them and fix them. And that's why we need so much time, 5 months or 6 months after the end of data collection. And in fact, right now, the Census Bureau has just announced that it has scheduled the release of the apportionment data by April 30th, 2021. They've also mentioned, though, that this is a fluid date and that they will keep stakeholders updated as to what's going on. The Census Bureau has also announced that soon they will have some experts talking about some of the anomalies that they're facing and what they're doing about them. They haven't done that yet, but they have announced that they plan to do that. Another thing that the Census Bureau is doing is they are working with the American Statistical Association Task Force to assess the data quality prior to the release of apportionment counts. And I'll say a little bit more about this. So can we have the next slide? Okay, so the American Statistical Association, recognizing that all the concerns that were going on about census data quality, formed a task force. And they recommended a number of quality indicators that could be used to assess the quality of the census. I'll say a little bit more about that. But they also made 5 recommendations. First, that the indicators should be readily available and used expeditiously to assess the quality of the 2020 census. And this included putting out measures of quality in advance of the apportionment counts. They also recommended that qualified external researchers should be granted access to the data to help conduct the analysis. And this was not a knock on the Census Bureau research staff, statisticians, mathematicians, survey people that work at the Census Bureau, but it was just given all the things that had to be done so quickly, the Census Bureau needed more help to get this done. And it would also help build the credibility of the results. And then as more data became available, which it will, additional assessments should be conducted, and the Census Bureau plans to do this. They also realized that the early planning for the 2030 census should build on a lot of the lessons that had been learned in 2020, and they should be conducted in public and include extensive stakeholder input. Again, transparency, building credibility of the census results. And finally, the Census Bureau's authorizing statute, and this is Title 13 U.S. Code, should be updated to reflect a number of things. Several were to include more of the Information Quality Act, which is something you can look up, some of that language into the authorizing statute. And also, and this would require work with the Congress and the Department of Commerce to see if you could, do something to wall off future politicalization of the U.S. Census. But again, this is not something that can be done in a vacuum. It would take the Department of Commerce, Secretary of Commerce, and the Congress working together to come up with a solution. Now, a detailed discussion of all the quality indicators and the methodologies that were used can be found at the link I provided. The National Academy Committee on National Statistics had a seminar where Nancy Potok and I discussed what the task force recommended, how we produced the results, and also had some great discussions that talked about various aspects of it. And you can find it at the link. Can we have the next slide? So a little bit more on census data quality. So this is what the task force will address in the short term. And if you go to the American Statistical Association website, you can find an update on how the Census Bureau is really working with the American Statistical Association. But these are some questions that are going to be addressed. And this is, do the quality indicators suggest a high risk of state level coverage error, i.e. undercounts or overcounts in the 2020 census? Which states have the highest risk of coverage error? Which are the following sources of census error that are likely causes of the high risks? And this would be the master address file creation or updating, the self-response phrase, the non-response follow-up phase, or the post-data collection processing, and which indicators provide the most compelling evidence. So let me talk a little bit more about some of the indicators. So one, a lot of the indicators are process indicators. They don't have a detailed measure of the coverage of the census. That will be done with the post-enumeration survey, and that will come out, well, it's not clear exactly when that will come out, but it won't come out soon. But these are things like looking at the percent of proxy enumerations, and these are enumerations with a non-household member at the tract level, for example, looking at the number of questionnaires that came back with just minimal information, like maybe the number of people, the number of questionnaires for which the Census Bureau couldn't get, or the percentage couldn't get any information. And again, this is described in the task force report or in the webinar that in the webinar that I mentioned. But the key to analyzing the data starts with looking at it at a granular level, like a census tract. And the reason for that is that's where you can start to determine patterns that could affect the quality of the data. So to give you an example, if you can actually do some pretty good analysis right now on the self-response data that's available at the census tract level, that the Census Bureau has made available. And you can see some things in it that raise some questions that should be addressed. And one of the things you see is that the distribution is flatter in 2020 than in 2010. So what that means is that there are more tracts that have higher response rates in 2020 than in 2010, and there are more tracts that have lower response rates in 2020 than in 2010. And if you start looking at this in a geospatial framework, and it's not, there is the City University of New York, for example, has a hard to count map, which is very, very interesting to look at. But what you start to see is that in more central cities, the response rates in 2020 are lower than in 2010. And the same thing is true in rural areas. And that the suburbs, the response rates in 2020 are higher than in 2010. So this raises questions about what happened with the enumeration in these areas. And that's what the ASA is going to be doing, is looking at these indicators to understand, are there discrepancies between the 2010 census and the 2020 census, for example, for their follow-up operations that are larger in some states than in others, that are larger in some cities than in balances of states, but to look at that kind of information and provide an assessment of that, that can be used to assess the overall quality of the census and address these questions. So can we have the final slide? So one more thing, stay tuned. There's a lot more that's going to happen that you might hear about. One, redistricting data. Will that be available by July 31st, 2021 or not? The Census Bureau right now is saying that the delivery of redistricting data has yet to be determined. So I'm sure that over the next few months, there will be a determination of that, but that's going to be one thing to keep aware of. Another thing, and I'm not going to talk about this very much, but there's something called differential privacy. And that's a method the Bureau uses to prevent the disclosure of information about individuals through publication of the data. There are a lot of stakeholder concerns about the effects of differential privacy on the use of small area data and small population data. And finally, there's going to, and that actually could result in, hopefully not, but it could result in some litigation. We hope that it won't, but it could. And finally, there's going to be more quality indicator analysis that will become available post the apportionment release. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Census Project for holding this event.
All right, thank you, Dan. Thank you, John. I've been working on this topic for close to 20 years, and I think I learned a few things I didn't know about. So that was very, very in-depth, very helpful. So we're going to open it up to questions. I've got a couple here. Just want to remind all our viewers that if you have a question, you can use the question feature on your dashboard to submit something. The first question, I think maybe should go to Dan. And this term, they're focused in on the term of the automatic census. And the question is, the Census Bureau is supposed to report at the end of the year ending in 0 automatically, but that didn't happen. Why?
Right. Well, so a number of us, I spoke about the resiliency of this automatic process, and a number of us kind of wondered what would happen because there were these two statutory deadlines. So one statute requires the Census Bureau to report by the end of December, and then the next requires that the president transmit this data transmission to Congress within the first week of the new Congress meeting, so in early January. And neither of those things happened. And a number of us kind of wondered, well, what will this mean for the automatic system? Will this throw the whole thing, the train, off the tracks, and we're back in the old days of Congress passing a new thing? I guess we won't know for sure until April. But the reason I think people are not concerned that that's what's going to happen is that during the litigation that was taking place, there's a bunch of different litigation that's happening in November and December. Some circuit courts, in ruling on the various delays that were taking place, noted that these statutory deadlines were important, but ultimately could be made more flexible because of circumstances. So, right in this case, what happened was it became impossible for the Census Bureau to produce accurate state totals by December, and I mean, honestly, thank heavens, like rather than send essentially fabricated numbers, they stopped, or they didn't stop. They worked very, very hard. They continue to work very, very hard to try to figure out how to do that like, now in the computer, but they're still basically just trying to find each person, make sure they're in the right household, make sure all the people are all in the right household, get rid of all the extra households that have been more than once enumerated, put them in order, and then from that figure out how many people are in each state. And that is the process. It's just taken a very long time, and so it's not going to be until April till that comes through. But the legal indications we've seen from the courts is that no one believes that that transmission of data will be any less valid than prior transmissions of data.
And I think the public trust issue around this, the principal cause was the pandemic, the COVID, because historically the Bureau finishes counting in late July, early August, but because of the delays in operations due to COVID, they did not finish until the first week of October. So that pushes the schedule later into the next year, as we found out. The next question, I think, maybe could be a toss-up, or maybe John. You spoke to the importance of the public transmission of the results. Can you speak to why that's important?
Yes. One of the main reasons it's so important is that it shows that there is no manipulation of the numbers after the Census Bureau has delivered them. So the Secretary of Commerce who gets the numbers, it's clear the Secretary of Commerce doesn't change the numbers. And it's also clear that that the President doesn't change the numbers, that the numbers are produced, they're available to everyone, and it just instills a lot of confidence and transparency into one of the most fundamental processes of our democracy.
Good. All right. This next question, I think, John, is directed at you. You spoke about anomalies, and that's in quotes in the question. Can you describe what typically are the kinds of anomalies that come up and how the Census Bureau fixes them?
Well, I can talk a little bit at a high level about what goes on. So what the Census Bureau will do is, as they are producing the counts at various stages, they will have subject matter experts look at the results. And if the results, and they use a number of resources to do that, and if the results don't agree with what they believe they should, then they dig in and say, okay, is this a problem with the data? Is it a computer error? Or is it just something that's changed at a local level? So that's one thing that goes on. There's a lot of review of the data by internal subject matter experts, and that leads to a number of investigations. A couple other things that could go on. I know the Census Bureau right now has mentioned a little bit that they're dealing with some issues with some of their group quarters institutions, and these are like college dorms, you know, halfway houses, things like that. So they are dealing with some of those to see if they can improve the counts. That has also been mentioned. But in terms of the detailed anomalies, the Census Bureau hasn't really come out yet and said they have announced that they've discovered anomalies. And as I said, this is not unexpected, because you always, whenever you run a huge data file through new computer programs, no amount of testing in advance can prepare you for it to run perfectly. So, you know, there's a process where you have to understand anomalies. The Census Bureau has said that they are going to be having future discussions with some of their experts about more about the anomalies that they're dealing with. So I would say stay tuned for that.
So I'm got a question of my own. I'm gonna take a little bit of a liberty here because I had a light bulb go on listening to your talk, John, about quality indicators and connecting it to what Dan was talking about, the history of litigation. I think this is the first time that we're gonna have specific quality indicators that with regard to apportionment. I don't remember that we did those, released any quality indicators in 2010 or 2000. And I wonder what both of you think that might do to spurring more litigation, especially for that 436th seat that goes to a state that's only got 800 or 900 people short of a new congressional seat. Do you think this is a risk that quality indicators are going to lead to more litigation?
I would say that it would actually, well, as you know, Steve, if there's a small difference between who gets the last seat, there would probably be litigation of some sort. But I think that the quality indicators will allow for a data-driven discussion, you know, about the results and about what's going on. And the census, you know, may compare very favorably to the 2010 census, which would be a good thing. And if there are some discrepancies, then the Census Bureau can actually address them and talk about what's going on. So it'll provide more of a data-driven discussion, I think.
Dan's nodding.
Like as John just said, if there's a small gap between 435 and 436, there will be litigation no matter what. So that's a given. And in the process of that litigation, undoubtedly these kinds of indicators would be revealed. So over time that would happen. I mean, what I immediately go back to think to in terms of comparison would be 1991, when the apportionment data was transmitted with an asterisk on it saying these numbers might very well be changed after we continue a series of evaluations of thinking about using statistical methods to change what's going to happen with these numbers. In the end, the Department of Commerce decided not to change those numbers, and so we will never know what would have happened had they gone back and said, actually, we've adjusted and some seats might be shifted around. The litigation for that then stretched on throughout the entirety of the next decade, and it started the decade before. So there's a pretty well constant move of litigation around these things. That's why I say it's one of the characteristics of the automatic apportionment system. I think the not necessarily a greater risk, but the place I would think about the way in which these indicators might change things is in terms. Right, we actually get a lot of these indicators eventually, right? The coverage indicators reports that are published a couple of years after the census goes through usually tells us a lot of similar things to this in terms of the number of proxies, the number of books who were omitted, the number of duplications, all these sorts of things. It just happens after the apportionment has already happened, after redistricting has already happened. So the interesting thing here is whether or not this will play into discussions about the legitimacy of the numbers, right? And Dr. Thompson's already indicated that the question of fitness for use is out there. And that's the more interesting question for me, or the more, I think, significant question is, what is this going to, how will having this information right now at the same time, which we're not used to having, change the way people talk about this data? Frankly, it might be a good reason for people to go back and read some of, we should maybe show some figures about the numbers of omissions, duplications, and proxy numbers from previous censuses. People recognize that there's actually a fair number of these things that happen even in very good censuses, so that there's good comparisons when these numbers do come out.
All right, I'm going to give folks one last chance to put a question in if they want. And maybe we can go back to the first slide. So if anyone has a follow-up from today's presentation, you'll see the emails for both Mary Jo and Howard on that slide to contact the Census Project. This deck will be posted on the Census Project's website to be accessed later. And I think, speaking of quality indicators, I can share that only 4 people have dropped out of the presentation during the almost hour that we've been here. So that's probably an indicator that this was a quality presentation. Congratulations, John and Dan. Thank you to Spencer and Ken Poole of our partners at the Association of Public Data Users who facilitated this event for us today. And thank you for dialing in and paying attention. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or follow-up. And with that, everybody have a good day.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care.